First, I'm John Dunn. I'm a physician from Texas. I work as an emergency physician at Fort Hood, Texas, and I help the Heartland on climate and environmental issues and sometimes healthcare issues and other things. And I'm happy to be the moderator of this discussion. And I don't have a clue as to what these guys are going to talk about, because I was asked at the last minute to provide the moderator discussion. The first speaker is going to be Dr. E. Calvin Beisner. Did I do it right?
Yes.
Good. PhD. Cornwall Alliance for Stewardship of the Creation of Scientific Orthodoxies, Politicized Science and Catastrophic Man-Made Warming. Sounds like he's a junk science expert, and I'll let him speak to you.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege and an honor for me to be here. Let's see if I can get this up high enough that I speak reasonably into it. It's a privilege and an honor for me to be here. I am a theologian and Christian apologist. That means not somebody who apologizes for being a Christian, but rather from someone who gives reasons for Christian faith, and a church historian by profession. And I have a layman's interest and considerable study in the science of environmental concerns, and particularly of global warming on the side. And I have always had a lot of interest in economics and politics, and I've written a few books in those fields. But I've never been particularly active in politics and economics in the past. What got me active in this was fundamentally my conviction that if we follow the policies being prescribed by those who are alarmed about man-made catastrophic global warming, we will do enormous damage to the world's poor. We will lengthen by many generations the period during which they continue to put up with low life expectancy, high infant and child mortality rates, high rates of all sorts of infectious diseases, especially those that are related to indoor air pollution and the like. We were delivered from such things by economic development. There is absolutely no escaping the high correlation between wealth and health and longevity. Simply no escaping that correlation. You have the exceptions among very poor people who live a long time, and you have the exceptions among wealthier people who die young. But they are precisely that. They are the exceptions. And if we want people to live long, and if we want people to live healthy, we must want them to be wealthy. But in order to fight global warming, in order to have any kind of even a theoretically detectable impact on future temperatures, we would have to embrace such strong restrictions on the use of fossil fuels, which are the most abundant and cheapest form of energy for electrification of homes and businesses. We would have to embrace such strong restrictions that we would cripple the rate of economic growth. We would indeed reverse the rate of economic growth in many countries around the world, and we would condemn poor people to continued poverty and to all of its attendant ills. The picture that I get of what the Al Gores and Maurice Strongs of this world want is the picture of the mother bending over the dried dung-stoked fire in a mud hut in sub-Saharan Africa. They're cooking her food and using that same fire to warm the hut. And she and the infant strapped to her back are breathing in the fumes of that dried dung and getting sick and suffering high rates for the many millions of women and children who live this way, suffering high rates of tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases that end their lives quickly. That is an unconscionable consequence from a moral perspective. That is an unconscionable consequence of the sorts of policies that are promoted. That's what motivated me to get involved in this battle. I had been quietly doing my thing as a seminary professor, quietly writing my books that are so esoteric that they never sell anything, and just enjoying life that way, raising my 4 1/4 dozen children. That figures out to 4 + 3, 7. And then suddenly realized I cannot sit by and remain silent in the midst of all of this. I was asked to speak on how this issue is affecting the evangelical world politically, and for that matter also in some ways theologically. And I'm going to depart a little bit from the title that was given. We were not held tightly to those. But I want to just give a bit of a history of how this has come to be a significant issue in America's evangelical world. Something in the neighborhood of about 40 million Americans claim to be evangelicals. You can raise or lower that number significantly depending on how you define the term evangelical. I don't think that's an enormous issue. The fact is that as they self-identify that way, they tend to identify with spokespersons who purport to represent them in various ways, and they tend also to approach certain public issues as voters in blocks. And over the last few years, particularly, there has been a concerted effort by certain evangelical leaders, or at least professed evangelical leaders, to create the impression that there is a groundswell of support among America's evangelicals for belief in CAGW, catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, and for belief that we can do something significant to reduce future warming, and for belief in the notion that we can do that at an acceptable cost-benefit ratio. This effort has been spurred primarily by, as far as public appearance is concerned, primarily by a man named Richard Cizik, who is the Vice President for Governmental Affairs of the National Association of Evangelicals. But behind him, sort of in the background, are men who have been major movers on the evangelical left for many years. Probably most important among them would be 2 men, Ronald J. Sider and James Wallace, or Jim Wallace. Ron Sider is the founder of Evangelicals for Social Action, and in the 1970s he wrote a book called Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. When I was a young fellow, recently graduated from college, I was having breakfasts for prayer and study as we would read books together with a pastor friend, and he once read Sider's book, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, and he said, "Cal, you've got to read this book. It will change your life." And until then, I had never really had significant interest in economics, but I knew logic, having been a philosophy major. I knew theology, I knew biblical interpretation, rules of biblical interpretation. I read Sider's book, and it did indeed change my life, but not quite the way my pastor friend anticipated it might. As I read the book, I said to myself, if this man butchers economics the way he butchers logic and biblical interpretation and theology, and if the evangelical world takes this book seriously and follows his policy prescriptions, which are essentially, at least in the early editions of the book, they were essentially prescriptions for a sort of a soft socialism, we're all in trouble. We will indeed achieve greater equality, but it will be an equality of poverty. So as a consequence of reading that, I thought I ought to learn a little bit about economics. So I just bought stacks of books on economics and read them. That's an old-fashioned way of learning, is to read. And in the process, I became interested enough to go ahead and do a master's degree in it, and then wound up writing a couple of textbooks in the field, and saw that Sider had become extremely influential in the evangelical world. In fact, that book, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, has now been through about 7 different editions, I believe, And little by little, he backed off some of his more clearly socialistic ideas, but he has never escaped the gut reaction to any problem that we have to turn to government for the solution. So Ron Sider is one of those. As founder of the Evangelicals for Social Action, he is grandfather, so to speak, to the Evangelical Environmental Network, which was spawned out of the ESA as one among a number of organizations connected to the National Religious Partnership on the Environment. Thank you. And Sider then provides a part of the background. Jim Wallace has been the leader of Sojourners, which is a very, very clearly socialistic organization in Washington that promotes what tends to be thought of as Christian socialism. These two men have been on the left. Now, in the 1980s, there were a number of different conservative writers, free market economist type writers, including myself, but also Ron Nash and Michael Novak and others, who wrote books that specifically refuted the ideas of Sider and Wallace. And frankly, in the 80s and the early 90s, we pretty well won that battle. And in the evangelical world, socialist thought, left-wing thought, went underground, but it didn't disappear. It really re-emerged under the environmentalist label in the mid to late 1990s with the founding first of the EEN, and then finally in a couple of years ago with the starting of the Evangelical Climate Initiative under the EEN, this led by Jim Ball, president of the Evangelical Environmental Network and a protege of Ron Sider. The Evangelical Climate Initiative came about in an interesting way. Sider, Ball, and others had been attempting to persuade the board of directors of the National Association of Evangelicals, which purportedly represents about 40 million evangelicals, although most of the board members are highly inactive, so they don't really speak for all of those people. But they had been trying to persuade the board of the NAE to sign on to a public statement endorsing global warming alarmism and carbon emission reductions to fight global warming. They were not able to get significant support for that within the board. And in fact, a group of us in late 2005, early 2006, prepared some papers that helped to inform people about that. We were, at that time, we had begun the organization, the Interfaith Stewardship Alliance, which later changed its name to the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. I have both a brochure about it and a copy of the Cornwall Declaration on Environmental Stewardship on the table at the back for you if you'd like to pick that up. We prepared some papers that subjected that kind of thinking to critique, and then we wrote a letter to the NAE board, an open letter, asking them not to sign on to this and giving them the scientific reasons and the economic reasons why they shouldn't. We prevailed. The NAE refused to sign on to it, and so the promoters of that statement then decided to go it on their own. They released the statement in February of 2006, the Evangelical Climate Initiative, and we then recognized that we needed to do something to provide a counter voice in the broader public. They had 86 endorsements from Christian college presidents, mission leaders, megachurch pastors, all people whose names, when I read down the list of names, I knew there wasn't anybody on the list who had a clue about the science or the economics of climate change policy or anything related to it. These were people who meant well, who wanted to show that they cared for creation, that they cared about the poor, but they really didn't understand the science or the economics involved. So I put together a team of authors. Dr. Roy Spencer, from whom you'll be hearing as the last keynote speaker today over lunch, a climatologist at the University of Alabama. Dr. Ross McKittrick, from whom I think you heard earlier in the conference, at least he was one of the speakers, and he's an environmental economist at the University of Guelph in Ontario. Paul Dreesen of the Congress on Racial Equality, who's an energy policy analyst and has written the outstanding book, Green Power, Black Death is the subtitle, but it's Eco-Imperialism is the main title. and then myself. And we wrote a paper that addressed the science, the economics, the politics, and the theology and ethics of this issue, called A Call to Truth, Prudence, and Protection of the Poor, an evangelical response to global warming. And we started off looking not for megachurch pastors and college presidents and others. We looked for endorsements from people who had expertise in the fields, because we believe that it is a serious abuse of the moral authority of religious leaders to ask them to sign on to declarations about which they don't know anything. The ECI didn't even tell you who its authors were. None of them turned out to have any expertise in the fields relevant to it. It had almost no data in it, no references to scientific sources, and we included data, references, everything else. And we wound up with a good list of endorsers with actual expertise in the relevant fields. In the couple of years since then, we have continued to have a sort of a back and forth debate in the public media over this. Without much surprise to most of you, you'll probably find it expected that the secular media tend to treat us as the deniers, the backwater eddy in all of this. But in fact, I think we have a better claim to represent evangelical thought in this. The Barna Group recently released the results of a poll of evangelicals that showed that those who actually meet a fairly significant definition of being evangelical put global warming very, very far down the list of their own political and economic concerns. That's contrary to the claims of the promoters of the Evangelical Climate Initiative and Richard Cizik and others like them. Last summer, the Southern Baptist Convention, with about 20 million members, passed a resolution on global warming that is almost identical in its position to our call to truth. We think that we really represent where most evangelicals are on this. And in fact, we think that we're going to be able to raise much more support on this, much greater visibility as we launch a campaign right now called the We Get It campaign, and as we continue with some other efforts. Our concern is that we not allow the evangelical world to be led down the primrose path of good intentions coupled with bad science and bad economics that results in hurting a lot of people. We believe that the scriptures tell us that human beings created in God's image to be creative and productive as He is, have the capacity to steward this earth in a manner that promotes human well-being as well as the well-being of other species. And we are all about coupling development and environment through sound theology, sound science, and sound economics. That's a bit of background on the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, and I would encourage you to come to our website, cornwallalliance.org, where you can read a variety of different papers that address the science, the economics, the theology, and the ethics on this all together. Thank you.